For our next session, Shoring Up, How to Achieve Rapid and Responsible Offshore Wind Development. Please welcome to the stage Vice President Climate, National Audubon Society, Sarah Rose.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Rose, and I am the Vice President for Climate at the National Audubon Society. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be part of the NASA Climate Campus, and it's a pleasure to be talking about offshore wind with you all and with our panelists today. Our climate work at Audubon focuses on two different strategies. One, it's focused on renewable energy deployment and maintaining, and then our second is focused on maintaining and conserving natural landscapes that support carbon sequestration, also known as natural climate solutions. So most of you know Audubon as a conservation organization that focuses on protecting birds. So why are we here at Climate Week hosting a panel on offshore wind? Well, because climate change. I don't have to tell you all, because you're here and you already know that climate change is the challenge of our lifetime. It's also the biggest threat to birds. Our Survival by Degrees report shows a stark reality. Nearly 500 species in North America face extinction unless we act quickly to cut carbon emissions, carbon pollution, and slow the rate of global temperature rise. Because addressing climate change is necessary for protecting not only wildlife, but for people too, both today and in the future. And like the rest of you in this room, we want to be part of the solution. And we know that renewable energy deployment is essential for decarbonizing our economy, reducing carbon emissions, and turning the tide on climate change. This is why Audubon is committed to engaging in the rapid and responsible onboarding of utility-scale wind and solar. That said, we also know that all infrastructure will impact bird populations. So we want to be smart about how we build, about what we build, and where. And we need to make sure people are also armed with the facts. Because the truth is, there are proven strategies that can help us avoid, minimize, and offset any impacts to birds and the habitats. These strategies are supported by a rapidly growing body of research and augmented by new technologies. And we're here today hosting this conversation because, as I said before, offshore wind is a solvable problem for birds. The status quo of living with the climate crisis is not. So not only is this a solvable problem for birds, offshore wind is a critical part of the solution needed to support birds and the communities we have in the future. As you can see from this graphic, there is so much potential for offshore wind to contribute to our renewable energy goals. And the reality is that offshore wind energy development in the US is still in its infancy, and we remain far behind the global leaders in production. To date, China is leading with 129 wind projects, followed by the United Kingdom, Germany, and Vietnam. Conversely, there are just 3 operational wind projects in the US waters off of Long Island in Massachusetts and Virginia, which collectively produce approximately 0.174 gigawatts, powering about 130,000 homes. So I guess you could say that the glass half full version of this is that the US industry is poised for growth. So our current national goals are to install 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy capacity by 2030 and 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind capacity by 2035. That's a lot of new development and not a lot of time. So to meet this goal, we're going to have to work quickly and we're going to have to work together to get this done. And as we've learned, the better the planning at the front end, the more successful and the development is likely to be. So the build-out continues. We need to be careful about monitoring and research to better understand potential impacts. To give just one example of what Audubon's doing to support this work, Audubon's Delta Director of Conservation Science, Eric Johnson, and other researchers in the region are using multi-sensor geolocators to gather data on flight behavior for the promontory warbler as they migrate across the Gulf of Mexico. The early data suggests that migrating songbirds like these warblers typically fly over the Gulf at altitudes much higher than that of an installed wind turbine. This research will provide new insights into how they use the airspace and respond to inclement weather. It's important because this data from this research will help us inform collision risk assessments for offshore wind in the region and can help support better planning, siting, and development of these projects. And as research is underway, Audubon is working with developers on shore and off to advise them on how to reduce negative impacts based on the latest science. We are also stressing the importance of projects including community input and that the related economic benefits are available to people living in frontline coastal communities. And as I said, we're part of the conservation community and we want to be part of the solution in moving offshore wind development forward. So today, I'm really excited to share that Audubon will be releasing a new report in January of 2025 focused on offshore wind and birds. And our report outlines a path forward for rapidly and responsibly deploying offshore wind in ways that solve for climate and speak for birds. It will include approaches that contribute to collaborative efforts and engage with developers and communities as part of the solution. And we will provide information on how members and the public can engage with the process, as well as pertinent state and federal laws. And as we will discuss today, there are already a lot of really good examples of what responsible offshore wind development can look like and practical technologies that can be used. I am so excited to get into our conversation with our incredible panel to talk about some of these efforts. So today, I'm really proud and excited to welcome to the stage Marissa Knodel, Senior Advisor of the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, Greg Lampman, Director of Offshore Wind Program at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and Emily Shurmshina, Director of the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative for Offshore Wind. And now, thank you for joining us on the stage. We can get to it. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to have everybody do just a quick 1 minute per self-introduction. So if we could start, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Marissa Knodel. I am a Senior Advisor at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. And for those who don't know, we are an agency within the Department of the Interior responsible for energy, mineral, and geological resource management on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf, which is roughly outside of the state water boundaries at 3 nautical miles to roughly 200 nautical miles. And so within that authority, we're the lead agency for authorizing offshore wind development.
Thank you. And Greg?
Good afternoon, everyone. Greg Lampman. I'm the Director of Offshore Wind at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA. The NYSERDA's role in development of offshore wind is basically to lead the development of those programs and to recruit those benefits for New York and the region. So we're responsible for the procurement of the offshore wind projects, for managing the contracts that stem from that, developing the supply chain that supports the industry's development across the region, ensuring that we have a workforce that's able to satisfy that supply chain and to build those projects or recruit those economic benefits for the state and for the region. We also work with our sister agencies on transmission planning and transmission development, as well as trying to be a bit of a liaison between the state and federal regulators and the offshore wind developers, making sure that the developers or the agencies understand some of the constraints that this emerging industry is under, but also helping the developers recognize they need to fulfill their environmental responsibilities and their permitting responsibilities to ensure that the projects move forward in a way that's successful.
Thank you. And Emily?
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Shurmshina. I'm the Director of the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative for Offshore Wind, or RWSC. That's a nonprofit entity that we're going to talk a little bit more about today. Essentially, my role is leading and discussing with researchers who are implementing the research and the funders and the agencies that are requiring that research associated with offshore wind. My background is in oceanography, and so it interface with the research community and data collectors, as well as those who are interested in the data and using that for decision making.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the introductions. So we're going to start with Marissa. BOEM has implemented a process of identifying wind energy areas and the leasing and approval process, including public input opportunities. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of this process, the public input, and how it came about?
Yes, absolutely. So the way BOEM goes about identifying areas for offshore wind, we call it a winnowing process. So the very first step is what we call a call area. So this is a very large area in a particular region or office state, And what we do in terms of the input process at that stage is we usually form what's called an interagency or intergovernmental renewable energy task force, which combines local, state, and federal partners. Tribes are welcome as well to go over what our planning process will look like. So this is a very large area. And then from there, we move to a draft wind energy area. And this is actually a new step we've implemented to incorporate more public input. We used to just go out with a final wind energy area, but based on public feedback, we added this additional step recently to get more public feedback at the draft stage. After that, we will finalize a wind energy area, so this will be a smaller part of the call area. And then after that, we will begin the process of planning a lease sale, where we will lease even a smaller portion of that to a developer to eventually develop a project. And as part of that whole process, there is an environmental review, there are formal public comment periods. We invite tribes to do government-to-government consultations. And we've recently begun partnering with the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, or NCOS, to do a marine spatial modeling approach. So we can layer all sorts of data, fisheries, shipping lanes, benthic data, info about birds and other marine mammals to make sure that we're identifying the areas that have the best potential for offshore wind, but also avoiding impacts.
Fantastic, thank you. So, Greg, I'm going to take it to you. We're going to talk about New York. NYCERDA has been a pioneer in responsibly developed offshore wind in New York with the early establishment of the Environmental Technical Working Group, which Audubon plays a part in. And can you talk a little bit about how this prioritization of environmental considerations came about in that process and how it's helped or not to support the development of offshore wind?
Sure. So prior to joining NYSERDA's offshore wind team, I was leading a program at NYSERDA called the Environmental Research Program. That was really designed to inform energy policy with data and science. So trying to understand the implications of our energy policies and providing accountability for the energy policies of the state and other states. And we were working on things like air quality and public health, climate change, deposition of atmospheric pollutants and related. And one of the things that we'd be looking at, for example, is collecting data on salt marsh sparrows in the South Shore of Long Island, looking at how much mercury is accumulating in the blood of salt marsh sparrows. Using that information, we were able to demonstrate that the reproduction rate of salt marsh sparrows were depressed as a result of those mercury contaminations, and use that data, hand it off to the Attorney General's office, who would then sue upwind states for coal emissions, which is primarily where our mercury was coming from. And so going through that process, back at around 2015, NYSERDA was starting to really move into the renewable space and advancing renewables terrestrially. And so we started looking at birds and bats and wind turbines and started to realize there was a lot of challenges between the developers of wind turbines and solar developers with the environmental community, is that they were running into each other because there was an argument about indirect benefits and direct impacts. And when I got recruited to the offshore wind program around 2015 or so as one of the founding members, I got asked to come in and bring that expertise and to bake that into the program as it got designed. So for New York, our offshore wind program is really predicated on our offshore wind master plan that was published in 2018. We're in the process of updating that now. But if you look at the master plan, it is dominated by interest in maintaining responsible development. So we came up with the tagline, advancing offshore wind in a way that's cost effective and responsible. And that's really designed to explain the tensions between these different stakeholder groups. So we want to first advance, so we want to build these projects. We need to hit our 9 gigawatts by 2035 goals and the decarbonization goals beyond that, which are something close to 18 to 20 gigawatts of offshore wind. But we want to do it in a way that's responsible. So thinking about all the stakeholders in the space, whether it's habitats, wildlife, maritime, the safe and efficient transportation of people in the state. And we want to do it in a way that's cost effective so that ratepayers are not burdened with undue cost. And so we work on all those different facets and are always trying to balance cost effective and responsible development as we push forward. So it's really in our basic design of the program is to be thoughtful about how we build these projects so we don't regret what we built 10 or 15 years from now.
Thank you. So, Emily, research plays obviously an important role in all of this development. And I know the concept of a regional science entity emerged about 6 or 7 years ago with the idea that federal and state agencies, developers, and conservation community organizations could collaborate on a one-stop shop and to make this efficient and allow public availability to the science and the data that's influencing these decisions. Can you talk more about how that sort of what seems like an unusual collaboration came about and how it's helped to influence some of this development?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a little bit of an unusual collaboration, and probably the most unusual thing about it is that it's entirely voluntary. The federal agencies, the states, the offshore wind developers, and the environmental nonprofits that participate in RWSE all identified the need for it collectively together, and they all come together on their own volition to work together and collaborate. So they recognize that each of them may be funding or requiring environmental and wildlife data collection and research related to offshore wind. There's several federal agencies involved, BOEM here on the panel today, and Marissa mentioned NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also oversees some of the bird and avian aspects of data collection and research. There are 14 states on the Atlantic coast that participate, and there are over 25 lease areas on the Atlantic coast, meaning there could be up to 25 different offshore wind companies involved in these decisions. So it's a very busy place on the Atlantic coast, and they're all funding and collecting data. So they recognize that in order to make sense of all of this, we really need to collaborate. We need to come together and understand what each of us is doing, and we want to work with the research community and really leverage the great expertise that we have in the universities and the great consulting companies up and down the Atlantic coast. So the way that this can benefit offshore wind, we're still a pretty new organization. We just formed in 2021, but the way that we're starting to see this benefit offshore wind already is some of the cross-sector conversations that folks are having. So for example, the states, all 14 of them, get together regularly and discuss what types of requirements they're including in their solicitations for offshore wind, and they're looking for efficiencies so that when a company applies or proposes a project to deliver power to a state, they're not proposing it in many different forms and many different types of requirements depending on the state. They're looking to align and make efficient some of these processes. And similarly, the states and federal agencies are talking together about what each of them are requiring of the offshore wind projects in their contracts and agreements to look for ways to reduce redundancy and keep the responsibility there for the company to provide data and assess impacts to wildlife, but to make it more efficient so they're not being asked to require and send data to multiple different places or send research results to multiple different entities simultaneously.
Thank you. That's helpful. So at Audubon, as I said in my remarks, we see offshore wind as a solvable problem for birds. But obviously this planning has to be informed by, as you said, research and community input. So on that note, Marissa, Audubon is engaged in shaping and supporting BOEM's environmental studies program in each of your regional offices to use the best science for siting. Can you say more about that program and any plans to sustain or expand it?
Yes. So first, always appreciate the collaboration. Our environmental studies program actually celebrated its 50th anniversary this year. And this program is within our Office of Environmental Programs, and it helps inform all of our leasing decisions, not just renewable energy and offshore wind. And we do a number of things. So the scientists there will conduct studies. We've actually put over $1 billion into offshore wind specific studies that will help inform the environmental reviews that we do when we identify wind energy areas that I mentioned before, but then also when we're doing more in-depth environmental impact statements when we're evaluating actual offshore wind projects. So we do those studies. We also have an environmental studies program that we put out every year, and we solicit ideas from the public. So if you have any ideas, feel free to submit them. And then we also partner with RWSC, and then during public comment periods, we welcome information, data, scientific information from the public and other entities to help inform our decisions as well. I would say that scientific integrity and environmental stewardship are core values at BOEM when it comes to our decision making.
So I'm going to go to Emily. Thank you. Earlier this year, RWSC released a science plan and unveiled a publicly available map that shows the locations of many ongoing offshore wind research activities. Can you talk briefly about the process to develop these resources and the intentions for their use?
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the science plan and the research planning map. We're really proud of those products. When we started looking across all of the different entities that are collecting data and funding research related to offshore wind, we realized really quickly that there was so much going on, we needed to develop some tools and resources to help make sense of all of that information and disseminate it, not only to our partners and participants, but to the public as well. And so we just completed the science plan in January of this year, and that's a document online on our website at rwse.org that essentially documents all of the future research ideas. What things should we be studying when we think about birds and bats and offshore wind and marine mammals and offshore wind? And so not only does it catalog all the different research ideas, the RWSE steering committee, which has equal representation from those 4 sectors we mentioned before, they developed a plan to collaborate with each other with some discrete action items for how they can advance collaborative research on the topics in the science plan in the future. So that's a really important foundational document for us. In addition, when we started mapping out, literally and figuratively, all of the different work that was going on, it was clear that a tool that allowed folks to see where the research was happening would be really valuable. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, actually funded the development of this research planning map, which again is a public tool, a public mapping interface that shows the location of where research is happening, whether that's the sensors on the bottom of the ocean that listen for whales, or antennas that listen for birds to fly by and listen for the tags that are attached to those animals to send a signal. We have a map that depicts all of those different activities. It lists the entities that are responsible for deploying that infrastructure and conducting that research. And so it's not only a public communication tool, but our experts that we engage on all of those different species group topics use it to plan their research together. So something as simple as sharing ship time, because we're going out to the same location offshore, and wouldn't it be great to collaborate and share the cost of a ship? Or experience about deploying an instrument. What does the seafloor look like at that location? Can I install a lander with a sensor on it? Will that location be good, and will it be resistant to being trawled up from fishing pressure or something like that, right? So it's this really nice platform that serves multiple purposes for us, and we're just launched it in July and looking forward to see it evolve over the next several months as folks really dig in and use it.
That's great. That's great. So we've been talking a lot about planning, research, science, and I want to talk, Greg, a little bit about some projects that are actually moving forward. We've got, at this point, leases are in place for projects that I understand that will provide energy for New York State. And I'm interested to talk with you a little bit about how New York is managing and permitting the cables that will be undersea, and that conversion infrastructure that is connected to the onshoring of that power. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Sure. So in general, a permitting process requires a developer to basically submit an application to the agencies to secure their permits to build their project. And the agencies then respond and try to figure out how can they help that project be designed in such a way that it complies with the regulations. That works fine for a building. If you're talking about a building in one individual location, it gets a lot more complicated when you're talking about an offshore wind project where you've got, turbines are spaced a mile apart in an area of tens of thousands of acres of ocean space. Cables are tens of miles of undersea and overland cables that bring those cables into the point of interconnections, and then the downstream upgrades for those grids. And so we have, again, as I said before, this is kind of a tension of how do you move forward and how do you do it effectively and responsibly. So in the first few projects, basically, the offshore wind developers were obligated to come in with a bid for the generation project and the transmission project. And they would make an interconnection, and that works fine also for areas where you're not constrained in how many cables you can put in the ocean on the seabed, or where you're using your best points of interconnection, your second best point of interconnection, third best. And so we really got two different pieces going on. So one is we are now transitioning to a transmission planning process. The idea being that the state would procure offshore wind transmission that starts with a platform out in the sea, brings a cable into New York City, makes landfall, climbs out of the water, goes to a converter station to go from DC to AC to the substation for distribution to customers, and all the downstream upgrades necessary. So those bids right now are being evaluated by the New York State independent system operator, who's responsible for transmission planning in New York State. And they're looking to buy between 4.77 and 8 gigawatts of transmission solution for future offshore wind projects. So we're advancing near-term projects on these radial lines where each project is bid as a project and a radial, but we're planning for these transmission in a broader way. That should reduce the environmental impact significantly by having one developer coordinating on the best routes for that cable. It takes care of issues like the Verrazano Narrows, where we've got to run undersea cable underneath the Verrazano Bridge with very limited space. And as an individual bidder or an individual developer, you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about what makes it best for my competition in the next cable and the next one. So having one developer do all that is really efficient. And then the other side of this is, each agency is responsible to protect the resource that they're responsible for. So we have some state agencies who are basically arguing stay in the water as long as possible. We need to have safe and efficient transportation on the land. You've got other agencies who are very protective of the maritime industry saying, do not put cables in the channels, the shipping channels. And then we've got regulators who are protective of fish habitat that say, do not put them on the side of the channels, put them in the channels. And so we have this conflict. We have a state policy of building offshore wind, and we have these other state policies of being protective of these different habitats. So we formed this group called the Cables Working Group, where all the state agencies are in a room. It's facilitated by NYSERDA, and we have conversations around how do we balance these different tensions? How do we make sure that we're building the most benign, impacting projects as we possibly can, considering all the regulatory responsibilities that all you have so that we can achieve our goals? So the Cables Working Group first published a whole bunch of data as to where those different resources are, published information about the relative risk to each of those resources and how the agencies see the compromises between them. And that information is actually being used by the ISO now as part of their evaluation process, so that when transmission developers are submitting their proposals to the New York ISO for their transmission projects, they're submitting better projects at the start, so that when they then get selected to build their projects, they're turning to the state agencies in the regulatory process, and they're coming at them with a much better plan than they would have otherwise had, ultimately resulting in a more responsible project overall.
That's great. That's great. So from that example and others, it's clear that there's a lot that's been accomplished so far, but there is obviously, as we were talking about earlier, still so much we have to do to reach our current US goals for offshore wind deployment. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what you see coming up next in each of your sectors. So Marissa, BOEM has approved more than 13 gigawatts, which is a pretty good chunk of gigawatts, according to the goal of offshore wind energy, enough to power about 5 million homes, on the way to our goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030. So what are you seeing as the most important next steps towards reaching that 30 gigawatt goal?
Yeah, so BOEM's role as the lead federal agency for authorizing offshore wind, the best thing that we can do is continue to approve projects, continue to offer new areas for offshore wind leasing, continue to make sure we have an efficient permitting and review process, and then make sure we're doing all of that with good research, scientific integrity, and public input throughout, so that we make these well-informed decisions and we have good projects. A slight good correction is actually we're a little over 15 gigawatts approved with our 10th project, offshore Maryland. So we are nearly halfway, to our goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030, which is incredible progress. If you, applause, that's great. Yes. Yeah, if you think that 3.5 years ago, there were 0 projects and no national offshore wind goals. Yeah. So very grateful for the BOEM staff for all the incredible work that they're doing. And moving forward on all of those fronts, we still have 5 more projects that we are currently in the active process of doing our environmental review for. The Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, announced earlier this year our 5-year offshore wind leasing plan, which includes up to 10 more potential sales off of every coast, and also excitingly in new areas like Hawaii and in US territories, which is authority we were granted under the Inflation Reduction Act. And in fact, we just had our first Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force meeting in Guam, and they are really, really excited about offshore wind and the possibility that has to meet their clean energy goals.
That's fantastic, and it just goes to show you that setting the goals and sort of setting an intention can really help move the process forward. So that's really incredible.
And providing the transparency and predictability is really what's needed to move the market forward in the US.
Yeah, thank you. So speaking of markets, so Greg, I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic conditions surrounding offshore wind, and I'm sure a lot of folks have read some of the headlines and talked a little bit about that. So the New York's procurement process, which is led by NYC, has had some challenges with respect to working with developers and some of the concerns about the sort of economic future of the offshore wind industry. How do you feel? Is that back on track? Is there, directions that, good signs for where it's going? And then how is NYC working to resolve and sort of reset the intention of moving forward with that? And is there, lessons learned for either both here or elsewhere in the Atlantic?
It's been an interesting run the last few years.
Indeed.
So, and I would say it's not unique to New York, and it's not unique to offshore wind. And so projects have a development timeline of something like 8 years, which is about what we think for offshore wind. Basically, the process is that the offshore wind developers bid at the beginning of that 8-year term and get a price. And so the state basically accepts it and goes through an evaluation process and locks in the price. This is what we'll pay. This is the price of the project. And so that was fine in 2018, and then we ran another solicitation in 2020. And then with COVID, we had a whole bunch of changes that resulted in just global changes in markets and global changes in interest rates. And ultimately, the projects that we had under contract and those that were in negotiations weren't able to move forward under the prices that they had secured through their contracts. Now, just an example, a 1% change in interest rates for financing results in about an 8% change in the price of a project. And so we had about a 5% change in interest rates over that period of time, so a 40% increase in the price to build a project. That's not sustainable in a contract with a fixed price, and so many of the developers had to cancel their contracts. So in addition to interest rates, the war in the Ukraine has also really been inspirational for the European countries to separate themselves from Russian natural gas. And so they have been doubling down and investing in offshore wind. Ultimately, what that meant for us is that we had been hoping to lean on the European supply chain for a number of years as we start to build a supply chain here. And ultimately, that supply chain door basically got closed because the European countries were making use of their existing supply chain. As a result, prices went up again. And so we had to find a way to adapt to all of this. We were a very emerging market, trying to get our investments started, trying to bring certainty to the markets, because the states are buying the energy, but really it's the private investment in the factories and private investments in the projects that are critical to get them built. So we've taken a number of steps from running accelerated RFPs to including an interest rate adjuster in our bids, so that when you bid, you have one price, and then we'll adjust it based on the commodity indices at the point in which you hit final investment decision. And so we've done a number of different interventions to try to prevent that in the future, but it just wasn't anticipated that these changes were going to happen. This morning I was at the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, so New York just became a member. That was announced this morning.
Yay.
But
Yes.
But the nice part about that meeting was, for the first time, everyone in the room was pretty optimistic. So the European countries are starting to feel like this is getting back on track. The Asian countries, South American countries, basically everybody who's been working on offshore wind is feeling optimistic. That wasn't the case in the last few years. So we published last fall, New York published a 10-point plan for how we are going to continue to power through this. We are foot on the gas, moving forward as quickly as we can to rebuild our portfolio, to get projects built, but again, doing it in a way that's thoughtful and responsible, and being as cost effective as possible. So a number of interventions baked into our process, but the point is, you need to be nimble in times when things are changing quickly, and we've been trying to do that. Adapt, but bring stability.
That's great, thank you, and that's a great story. So Emily, Audubon is engaged in efforts to establish RWSCs in the Gulf and the Pacific as well. So how might the Atlantic RWSC engage with those entities in the future, and especially regarding the numbers of databases and the amount of research data that would be required to really get those off the ground? So you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. We're lucky that several of our steering committee members, Audubon included, and of course the federal agencies, all have a national scope. So they have an interest, because of the scopes of their organizations, in helping us look beyond just the Atlantic to apply some of the work that we do in other regions like the Pacific Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. And they feel pretty strongly that some of the things we've been working on translate to other geographies, because some of these questions are kind of independent of where you are. Some of the work that we've been doing, it applies no matter where you're located. So for example, data management is often accomplished by the data type. So you store a certain type of data in a certain place, and you do it in a certain way. And so whether you're collecting that data on the Atlantic coast or on the Pacific coast, the practices and the standards and the recommendations that we're coming up for those data management workflows are the same. So we can leverage those from coast to coast. And that's important because I think the overall goal is that we want to be able to answer the question about offshore wind impact, whether that's a greater impact than the impacts of climate change that we're also experiencing. So to do that, we need long-term archival data storage to make sure that this data is available for the life of the offshore wind projects and beyond, so that we can look back and kind of understand how has the ecosystem changed underneath these offshore wind farms, and has that industry improved the environment and worked to lessen climate change. So it all comes back to kind of sound data management and making sure we have that legacy preserved of data, and that transcends geography. So we're happy to share those lessons learned with our partners in the Pacific and Gulf of Mexico.
Thank you. That's great, and we're excited to see where that can take us. So I have one question for each of our panelists as we come to the end of this session, and I just want to appreciate your time. And kind of finishing with a note of optimism. Greg, I'm going to start with you. What are your hopes for offshore wind over the next year?
So I'm looking forward to stability. So
good luck.
So it has been a tumultuous few years.
Yeah.
And that is first difficult on staff at BOEM, at New York State, and others. And so I think if we can go back to predictability, steadiness, and consistency, that's going to be really helpful for the industry, particularly an emerging industry like this. As I say, these projects are billions of dollars of capital for investment. And in order to attract that capital at a low risk interest rate, which is great for ratepayers, we need to be able to demonstrate that they're good investments for those investors. And having a stable industry allows for that, which is going to help bring costs down. It's also going to allow us to better coordinate and integrate with all the different stakeholders in the space and make sure that we're reflecting their views in the way we advance, rather than being responsive to market forces that have been driving decision making of late. And so, just a simple example of that is we had contracts that, one of the obligations that New York has in our contracts is that the developers contribute $10,000 per megawatt bid to support environmental monitoring, both on the fishery side and on the wildlife side. And the idea of that was to support, these individual project sites are intensive study sites, but there wasn't really anybody working a lot of detail in between them. So you think of them as intensive research, and interspatial research is an important part of it. So we started that process, and part of it was in hopes of supporting like RWSC and the efforts that they're doing, so they could coordinate that research and we could get better outcomes from all of it. So as a result of projects canceling, RWSC and on the fisheries side, there's a group called the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance with ROTA that works in the same sorts of processes on fisheries. And so that $10,000 could flow to them. You're talking about tranches of money of $12 or $15 million would flow to them, and as a result of contracts canceling, that money got pulled back. So I know in the case of ROTA, they were ramping up on staffing, and then the money dissolved, and it's coming back again. So all of these decisions and cancellations and pullbacks in the market have effects not just on the projects themselves, but ripple out across everything. So bringing stability, bringing consistency, bringing a steady cadence and predictability overall is going to be a really important part, and it feels like we're going in the right direction.
Awesome, that's great. So Emily, same question. What are your hopes for the next year?
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of Greg's answer a little bit, that all of that certainty, all the projects that BOEM has approved in advance through the permitting process, all of the projects that the states are starting to procure energy from and are starting to be constructed now, those provide the juice for the research, right? So we're going to start to see a lot more money flowing to support data collection and research related to wildlife, and we're going to get to sink our teeth into that for the first time and really start to see the results. What does it look like during an offshore wind construction activity? How are wildlife impacted? Those data are being collected now, and folks are starting to look at the data now, but we're going to start to see the outcomes and the results and be able to broadcast those a little bit more widely than we have been over the next year, and I'm really looking forward to that.
That's great, thank you. And then Marissa?
Yeah, as I'm reflecting here, there's been a lot of up and downs in the past few years. but we are trying to build a new domestic industry from the bottom up, and we have a lot of, I think, successful stories. But to paraphrase what someone told me once, projects move at the speed of trust. And I think that it's going to be really critical as we move forward. Another core value at BOEM is inclusive and equitable engagement. And so we've been really trying to get out there in the community with tribal nations and the public to make sure that everyone feels like they are a part of our decision-making process. And my hope for the next year is that as these projects start to get developed and come online, that people actually see the benefits that they have, not just for our climate, but also in terms of jobs and local economic development as well.
Thank you. And just thank you all for being part of this session today. I know I'm coming away from this conversation inspired by what's possible. As I said earlier, this is a solvable problem, and I would say that this partnership that we've got reflected on the stage, conservation organizations, federal agencies, state agencies, we're all working together to try to solve this problem, not just for birds, but for all of us and for our planet. And I would say that those of us who care about these issues, those of us who are here today, those of us who we interact with, we have both the opportunity, but then arguably the responsibility to take action, to move these projects forward, to move these policies forward that are going to help us get to the outcome that we want to see at the end. So I hope you all will think about that. I appreciate everybody being here, your engagement, your support for climate action, being part of New York Climate Week. Thank you to the Nest. Thank you to our panelists for being part of this. We're really grateful, glad to be here. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.